Kevin, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon on a Friday afternoon. So stoked to meet you. Yeah,
Thank
how
you,
are you,
Mark.
sir?
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. I loved reading about your background, and we got a ton to talk about. I mean, you're top designer over at Nike. I mean, geez, we did some work with Nike. A very few number of their executives came and went through our SEAL Fit training a few years ago, and then Nike had organized some work with top high school football teams, and we did something with them out in Green Bay Packers Stadium a few
Oh,
years
wow.
ago. It was like 8 or 10 years ago. It was great fun. And I remember being up on the Nike campus and getting like $1,000 or $2,000 credit in your Nike store up there. And I came home like loaded to the gills with all this great stuff.
Yeah,
Anyway, that's my experience with Nike. A little different than yours.
the employee store is quite a generous place. That's an awesome discount.
Yeah, that sure was, man. That was like thousands of dollars worth of stuff. I was giving it away for months. Anyway, so I don't, the show isn't about Nike, but I do want to get into kind of that experience and design you had there, and really what shaped you to get into thinking about reimagining design. But what is give us a sense of for like what shaped you as a human being? You know, where did you grow up? What were your parents like? What were some of the influences that kind of shaped the clay of your mind and heart and spirit to be who you are today? And then we'll kind of just see where that takes us.
Yeah, no. Yeah, definitely. I think I was born technically in Newburgh, New York, but I spent the majority of my
Wow.
childhood in the Detroit metropolitan area, sort of
Okay.
right in the heart of
Right in the
American
thick of it.
auto.
Yeah.
Most of the most of the neighbors, as I remember, were technicians working in factories or engineers or business folks working for the American automotive brands.
Was your
And
father in that industry, or how did you end up there?
I actually know, so my father worked in retail. So he was a
Mm.
master merchandiser for large department stores, brands like JCPenney and the like. And my mom had worked in banking, banking retail, but also had experience starting her own business, and was just a great mom to the family, to the
Mm.
household.
Mm-hmm.
My parents originated from the South. Both sides descendants from previous generations of slavery, and
Really? Okay. Yeah.
and definitely the stories of some of the egregious assaults on their humanity.
I bet. Oh
In the book,
gosh.
I talk about my mom, like before she was even two. She was one of 10 kids on her side, and when they arrived home on Sunday morning from church, they met their home. It was literally burning embers. Their home had been burned to the ground
Oh
uh,
no.
from supremacist aggression,
Mm.
and also institutional stuff in terms of like the forces that be wanting to put a highway through the neighborhood. And so the intimidation of those who owned land, especially within those black neighborhoods, like
Mhm.
that was sort of the product of like what my parents came from and what they came out of. And they migrated north, and that's when they had us kids.
Wow. Okay.
So
That's fascinating, and it's really interesting how that's epigenetically as well as through the stories and the behaviors shaped you as a human, right? And what do you think some of the positive aspects of that, or maybe even the not so positive? How did that affect you as in your formative years and how you grew up and
yeah,
your view of
I'm
reality and the stories that you told yourself?
yeah, definitely had an influence. I can say, like, I really appreciate the fact, again, I feel privileged that I grew up in a home with a, hardworking mother and father, and
Mhm.
held the family unit tight. I was one of three kids, and they created an atmosphere of creativity, also leaning into who we were as people. Just
Mhm.
knowing that, like, having us kids believe that anything was possible for our life, despite the obstacles, despite
Mhm.
perhaps the resistance that society may sort of throw our way.
Mhm.
That life is not always fair, and that you're going to encounter people that may not like you for a wide variety of reasons, but you
Right.
still got to be who you are. You still got to know where you come from. You got to be proud of that, have some pride and dignity in who you are, and lean forward in life. Follow those curiosities, and
Right.
and work hard. be consistent, be disciplined, and anything can happen for you. And just know
Yeah.
that. And that was
I love
constantly
that
reinforced.
story. I love that hearing that coming from a successful individual like you, because the narrative can be so disjointed, in the media and the news, and this big kind of war of critical race theory, and it's really kind of a mess. And unfortunately, people get really contracted in trying to have a conversation about it. I unfortunately, am exposed to that a little bit more now
Hmm.
through I finally re-engaged to finish a doctorate program at Pepperdine, and most of the people in my class are persons of color and intersectional. I'm learning all these terms that I never really knew about as a white
Hmm.
guy, and it's fascinating, and it's really developed a lot of sensitivity to the experience that you're talking about. That I didn't share. You know what I mean? And so it's like really interesting to me. I'm,
It's funny.
I'm curious, since we're on the subject, like how was your experience in the professional world, and maybe even to this day that could be different than mine, to just help people understand like how you had to show up as a professional,
Hmm.
as a black professional versus the not, like if I was in the same role, how I would have to show up.
Yeah. A quick anecdote, really fast.
Yeah.
Nicole Hannah Jones, author of the 1619 Project, and she's definitely has been sort of navigating a lot of dialogue with
Right.
all things critical race theory and whatnot. But we actually went to undergrad together. We
Oh, is
graduated
that right?
same year, and we
Yeah.
kept in touch through the
It's a
journey.
very hot subject because there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. I think the critical race theory itself, but we don't
Yeah,
have to go down that rabbit hole because I don't know if everyone would appreciate it the way you two, that the two of us would as intellectuals kind of talking about it. But I'm
true,
more interested in your personal experience.
sure. No, navigating forward. I think it started probably in college, as well as that first job out of college, where again, like there may have been some initial resistance because I did felt like, oh wow, I'm by sheer identity, I'm feeling like the other in the room.
Right.
By background, by language,
By the number of people.
by the number of people, like I'm definitely one of few here, and in terms of like how maybe I was either understood or misunderstood, I felt some winds of resistance, but I also felt fair winds of encouragement. Like
That's great. Right.
there were people of all race, creeds, belief systems coming out to support,
Right.
which I appreciate those advocates, those mentors, those encouragers.
Right.
But you always had some resistors, and you just sometimes wondered like why the resistance? I'm just trying
Right.
to learn the work, trying to do the work, just like everybody. Where is that coming from? And I think it was just always being aware of the thought process of, okay, now I'm being forced to question this person's behavior. Where is that coming from?
Right.
If it's about honest like deficiencies in what I'm doing in the work, we can have a conversation all day on constructive critique. I'll welcome that all day.
Right. Right.
But when you're forcing me to go to this, like, what is it? Passive aggressiveness? Is it subjective? I'm
Right.
not your favorite because of my identity. Is it bias? Is it racism? Like having to constantly question that based on what's happening around me, or making sure that I'm spending energy, and hindsight being 2020, it was almost like unproductive energy, making others feel comfortable with my presence.
Right. You're working overtime. Like you have like a 20% tax or so on your time and your mental energy to just try to make sure that you're not,
Yeah,
the cause of that, I guess you could say. That's fascinating.
exactly.
I imagine you got to a point where you recognize that a lot of that was, denial of deep rooted biases, upbringing, from parents who had strong racist tendencies and whatnot. And that stuff's hard to route out as an adult. That's why I think adult emotional development, it's not just about a trauma, it's about the way you are conditioned to think,
Hmm.
period, for everybody, right? Because it's on all sides of the fence. It's so important today. I'm a big advocate of emotional development,
Hmm.
aka therapy, but I call it emotional coaching.
Oh,
Because therapy implies that you're broken, and some people are with trauma, but I don't like that. I think everyone just needs some support to open up and clear up shadow and bias, so
I
they
agree.
can become more whole. That's fascinating. So let's talk about just your interest in design. It's not something that I really have any familiarity with, like how a mind like yours thinks that can design something completely new that didn't exist before? Where did that come from, and how did you kind of foster that?
No, you mentioned earlier, sort of the prestige at Nike and having worked in design. But it's funny, my career didn't start in design.
Didn't
I could say that I drew as any child would, like for hobby, but
really? You
notions of
just love
design,
drawing? Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
loved it. I drew everything. That was the way that I broke down the world, what I was observing. My
Right.
parents encouraged it, but any notion of design, it felt under the abstraction of art. And with as much sacrifice as my parents were putting into sending us kids,
Yeah,
and,
you weren't
and
going to go into art, right? Because there's that's fascinating. That's a bias too, right?
in that ways, I could say in that ways, I'm guilty of that same bias, right?
Right.
I had this preconceived notion of what could get you a good job, and because I liked engineering and all that, I started there and had a great first chapter of career. But fast forward when I pursued an MBA to add the business layer to my tech background, and then I ended up at Nike of all places. I started at Nike in a business planning capacity. It
Oh,
wasn't
interesting.
design,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the product person within was like, okay, where's the product folks at Nike? How can I meet them? And then the collegial culture that Nike is, and you've seen the campus, like a coffee chat is no problem there, and someone
Mm-hmm.
will kick you to two more people to have coffee with.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, I met some product folks that eventually said, you know what, why don't you try your hand at a side hustle stretch assignment? Just
Mm.
show what you can do and show us, and we'll see.
Oh,
And
that's cool. So you
yeah,
actually had a side hustle assignment. They said, okay, go design this thing. Was it a shoe or what was that first project?
well, it's funny. I again, coming from business planning, there was an innovation group that said, help us out, help us with some of the numbers. We don't have a numbers guy here. Can you
I
help us
see.
out with
Right.
that?
Right.
And I started peering in and offering that support. And then eventually, I was afforded a chance to interview for an operational job within global footwear. So that got me closer to product. And
Mm-hmm.
that was the first time that I saw real professional designers, and the first time in my career. And I leaned into them, meeting friends, creative friends, and because of my engineering volition, and I had some comfort with 3D stuff, I was like,
Right.
oh, let me latch on. And some of my newfound creative friends actually gave me opportunities to stretch myself. So that's how I started finding design in the Nike environment, was getting just some runway to try some things. And the Jordan brand was the first category. A man by the name of Dwayne Edwards, who was the footwear design director at the time, had too many briefs, not enough designers. He said, you meet me in the morning at 6. We'll commiserate on this project. I'll mentor you through it, but you got to do the work. And then we would go do our day jobs, and then I would work on his stuff at night.
Oh,
so,
wow. That's
so
great.
we did that for a better part of a year, working double duty. And Jordan Brand mentored me through getting two shoes to market, two different models to market. They invited me through their entire process.
Mm-hmm.
Those shoes did really well that year, and that led to other open doors.
Right.
But it's funny, I might get credit for some design work at Nike, but I wasn't officially ever a designer at Nike.
Ah, interesting.
But I
That's
got
cool.
stuff to market through design skill, and
I imagine it's just an intense collaboration of teamwork, right? So, like, what does the teamwork look like to get a new Jordan shoe from concept out to the market?
yeah, it's there's sort of this sort of implicit triad model that's wired throughout the product engine of Nike, or any
Mm-hmm.
competitive brand for that matter too, where a designer will come to the table, a product marketer or manager will come to the table to speak on behalf of the market landscape, the business,
Mm-hmm.
the distribution, merchandising channels, and then you have the footwear developer or engineer that knows what it's like to commiserate, collaborate with the factory downstream,
Right.
and can kind of anticipate what the factory has to deal with in terms of materials and methods of making. And so those three voices have to be at the table, and they got to nurse the idea. And it might be just a sketch to, like, eventually we'll get some samples from the factory, and eventually there might be a real like thing that you want to actually mass produce.
Right.
But it's got to survive gates and dates through a long process, because it's not just the shoe itself; it's how that shoe sits on a store environment, next to
Right.
a wall full of shoes.
Right.
So all these gates and dates, all these filters, all these decisions, it's like 18 to 24 months before.
Was
And
was Michael Jordan involved at all? Did he have veto power over the designs, or what was his relationship? Was it just strictly financial?
I don't know the nature of that relationship now, but when I was an employee, he was officially a president by title, and he was part of the business.
Oh, really? Wow.
And yeah, he
Interesting.
had a special title, and he had veto rights in terms of how the brand was used. That's what I remember when I was working there.
Interesting. Well, it
Yeah,
makes sense. It's his name after all.
indeed.
Fascinating. Okay, so what's your proudest accomplishment, and or the project that you feel like you had the biggest influence on?
Uh, it's. I think it was more like first a career gamble that led
Hmm.
to like what I'm really known for from a design angle. And as the first was, as I mentioned, I never earned the title officially of designer, even though I got design work through the hopper.
Right.
Um, I made I encountered a fork in the road where one I could have continued to claw and scratch another 10 to 15 years on side hustles before Nike would pedigree me as a rock star footwear designer. Or meanwhile, the world is like changing all around outside of Nike. Like,
Hmm.
designs being celebrated on the cover of business magazines. We're seeing the advent of digital and physical ecologies like Apple coming to life, the iPod, the iTunes, all these ecologies of experience. And I saw a little bit of myself in that convergence. But
Hmm.
a few shoe projects weren't going to answer the creative leg of my three-legged stool at that point. It
Hmm.
was rather
Right.
short, so I decided to quit my Nike job and go back to school. I went back to grad school for a second time
Oh wow.
to,
Okay.
to really solidify my creative foundation properly while
Hmm.
not leaving behind my tech and business backgrounds. And
Hmm.
it was a move to really stand for uh, the intersection of these converging disciplines coming together, and that I would
Hmm.
stand for innovation from the rest of my career, like and work on
Hmm.
innovation projects the way I wanted to. And
Mm.
thankfully, I hitched my wagon to some I hitched my wagon to some business partners that thought the same and had the same belief system about where the future was going,
Hmm.
and ended up standing up some runways. And the last of which was creating this incubator that was acquired by the Boston Consulting Group, and they
Mm.
really supercharged it.
Right.
Where the big BCG animal is a consulting engine, but inside of them, there's actually a venture creation engine. It's an incubator that
Right.
spins out companies. It creates and spins out companies.
Oh, that's cool.
And I got to lead the design leg of that three-legged stool for that incubator, which was
Right.
such an honor to be a part of that.
That sounds like a blast. You must have seen some incredible projects. What were any notable projects come out of there in terms of companies? That
I
might.
mean, one of my favorite ventures was Bosch Engineering coming to our Berlin Innovation Center.
Hmm.
And we worked the inverse. We weren't on airplanes flying like consultants do. We
Right.
had innovation
They
centers.
came to you. Yeah.
They came to,
Right.
and they lived in residence with us. So
Right.
we got to ring fence designers, technologists, strategists, and the Bosch folks lived in residence at that Berlin studio, and they trusted our process. They went on an innovation journey, and they incubated an e-scooter ride sharing platform where they deployed thousands of scooters across these megacities in Europe. People could just kind of check them out with their phones. You didn't need anything more than a driver's license to ride them. So
Wow.
it was almost like early before the advent of all the scooters that we saw a few years ago. This was an early venture that really sparked and made traction in Europe in a good
That's
way.
cool.
And that was Bosch coming to us with just a question around mobility, help us with mobility. And the team generated that.
Wasn't Bosch an eyeglass company?
Bosch is like heavy German engineering.
Oh, German engine. So different than Bosch and Lohm, or maybe there was some relation years ago. Probably. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So these businesses were real. This went well beyond the PowerPoint deck, if you will.
Right. What I'm passionate about leadership, and I'm getting my doctorate in global leadership and change. What were
Cool.
some of the big insights you had around what successful leadership looked like at an entrepreneurial level to for these, especially for a company that is a big kind of
Mm.
big stable secure company trying to be entrepreneurial like we were talking about with Bosch, or someone who would come to an innovation lab? What are some of the leadership principles that help them be successful?
Yeah. No. I honestly think it took some initial pilots to bring disparate disciplines and different
Hmm.
representatives from those disciplines into the same war room together.
Right.
And we've come to find pretty quickly that even though folks are familiar with the Venn diagram showing how disciplines can come together and collaborate, in reality, it's still the exception, not the rule.
Right.
And I found in those initial convenings of teams, people were tripping all over each other, or they were getting hung up on someone else, perhaps in the room had a bias toward hypothesis driven problem solving. And they wanted to ram an answer down the throat of the team in the process until proven otherwise. Until you get convinced me that this answer is wrong, I'm going to keep driving it. So you had that kind of personality. You had others in the room coming from different disciplines that might have had a more abductive or inductive sort of thought process.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they were feeling marginalized or not, listened to. And at the same time, they had to develop the confidence and courage to speak up, maybe when maybe they haven't had to in previous patterns of
Right.
collaboration. So we were forcing everyone's hand to do things differently.
Interesting.
And it's funny, I think from a leadership perspective, just the first act of getting the teams to just openly talk about it, like, where are you coming from? Where are you coming from? How do you like to work? How do I like to work? What stresses me out? What are my triggers? What are your triggers? And
Right. To
getting,
talk about the process instead of the actual just doing the work all the time. So working on themselves, working on the idea of being a collaborative team while you also have to keep the project moving forward.
that's right. Exactly.
That's a really interesting, that's a valuable skill. There's a concept that we're playing with called the deliberately developmental organization.
Hmm.
And this is the idea of basically working on yourself while you're working in the organization. So
Hmm.
we've heard the old school, like work on the company while you work on, while you work.
Yes.
And it's really more about structural or OD, organizational development. This is, that's still germane, but if also working on the individuals or having the individuals become or use the work environment as their primary developmental laboratory, so they
Hmm.
grow as human beings. And I think this is a new
Hmm.
frontier in kind of OD and leadership development because, people are spending 10, 15 hours a day, or a minimum of 8, but you and I know professionals are spending way more than that, at least thinking about it. So you want your work environment to be a place that stimulates and accelerates your growth as a human as opposed to shuts you down. Right? This is
Yeah.
why people are leaving organizations in the Great Resignation because they feel shut down, whereas maybe either because of their freedom at home where they were starting to grow again, they find they had this stark kind of feeling of being really like they don't want to go back into that stunted growth environment. So it sounds like you were kind of unlocking a little bit of that already in these innovation labs, which is pretty cool. Were you embedded or were you a facilitator in those environments?
I think, through our first few ventures where we are just sort of proving the model, proving how we could build these businesses and the solutions within them, I was embedded,
Yeah.
definitely a sort of a co-founder of the initial ventures I was a part of.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
my charter was to represent design. But as we
Mm-hmm.
started to scale the platform, I had to move into more of what I call a servant leadership
Yeah.
functional role to
Right.
ensure that if we're replicating designers like the volition I was providing, we have to find more designers that are going to come into these ventures and have the courage to contribute as well and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully do it better than I was doing it in the initial
Mm-hmm.
outset. But my charter was to then serve that cohort of designers as they were seeded into each of the ventures as the whole
Yeah.
platform was
Oh, that's
scaling.
cool.
Yeah.
Well, I love that you mentioned servant leadership. That's been a popular kind of leadership model or theory. One of the criticisms is that often, with someone who adopts servant leadership as kind of a leadership mindset, is that they end up giving all of their time, energy,
Mm.
all of themselves in service to their team, and then they end up getting burned out.
Uh,
How did you deal with that, and how did you avoid burnout, or did you? Or what was your experience like?
um, I think to your point, like I definitely didn't coin the term servant leadership.
Mm,
And in the book, I talk about this other extreme of gatekeeping, but
yeah,
I
right,
at least had a wherewithal to know, like, okay, there's a gradient here, and I'm going to try to bias my time toward the servant end, the
right,
service end.
nice.
But I think I try to tactically break it down and unpack like the key lessons learned that I learned through my previous career experiences.
Hmm.
um, if I'm charged to be a leader of any team, I gotta make sure that they trust me first, or that
Right,
there's trust established within the team, and
right.
just making an inventory of the ingredients where we can be in service to each other.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a vision that I need to articulate as that team's leader, I need to ensure that that team feels bought in, that they've helped inform the vision, even though I might
Mm-hmm.
have to articulate it and provide an oomph of clarity to that vision. But I do want
Mm-hmm.
to like carve up the work that needs to be done and give people the runway, the role clarity, the license to
Mm-hmm.
own pieces of that collective vision.
Right.
Just as a few examples. So, but I also think that like it wasn't about me just carrying forward as a facilitator to constantly serve and unblock the team. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
the team needed to see me do the work too.
Right. Right.
And there was there were many moments where there was just an ability to provide quiet leadership, to come into some gnarly situation that the team was uncomfortable with, get my hands dirty with them, show them perhaps like how I
Mm-hmm.
would attack it,
Mm-hmm.
and give them some example, some confidence, some rooting to then try it for themselves.
Right.
And I think those moments sort of brokered better trust, where
Yeah.
the need to unblock or the need to do things for them sort of lessened, where they were off and running at that point.
Yeah.
So
I
it's a
love that. I
balancing
mean,
act.
we deployed that in the SEALs as officers because we had to go through our, we went through our basic underwater demolition SEAL training side by side with all the, all the enlisted troops. And, it's a small community, 2,000 strong, maybe 400 officers. And so we didn't have an us versus them or I'm above you attitude because we trained side by side and we had to know and be able to do everything
Wow.
reasonably well. Whereas we also knew that these guys are going to be drilling in to become experts at,
Mm,
certain things. And so you could never, you don't want to, you could be good, but you're probably never going to be the best
mm.
at any one thing. Right. And so it was really, the leadership was really nuanced like that. And so you had to do a lot of show and tell, you had to prove that you could do something, lead by example, walk the talk, that kind of thing. But then for an equal amount of time, you had to get out of the way and not be the boss, let them flourish, both so they could learn, but also because they were the experts, ultimately.
That's fascinating.
So
Wow.
one of our mottos was ready to leave, ready to serve, ready to lead, ready to follow, never quit. Right. And so that meant, you might be leading one moment, but guess what? The next moment you might be following and serving and,
Love
and
that.
so we're always switching roles. And it sounds like you kind of experienced that in that innovative environment.
Yeah, for those multidisciplinary teams to thrive, we had to orchestrate that just as you're describing it.
Yeah.
That resonates as you describe it. It resonates in terms of how I saw teaming work
Right.
when within teams, at least, that were successful or found success.
Right. The title of your book was Reimagining Design, right?
Mhm.
And it sounds like really it's about innovation. So, what can you tell us about innovation that maybe would be a unique perspective that you have?
I think like every organization arguably wants to be innovative.
Right. It's a critical skill nowadays because you have to reinvent yourself constantly. The world's moving so
Totally.
fast, this exponential age that we're in and all.
Totally. It's yeah, I think every organization has to think about like what does growth mean for them. To
Hmm.
your point, like there might be parts of the business that are maturing or like sort of out of date and they need to be refreshed, renewed, rejuvenated. So we're going to find that new source of business growth. And
Hmm.
hopefully we hope it's respectful growth that's considerate of the environment, considerate of
Right.
people that are part of the engine, all
Right.
these things.
Well, that's
Um,
also being kind of required by all the stakeholders, right? Isn't
yeah,
it nowadays? Both boards, ESG movements, SEC, if it's an American company or whoever the European equivalent is, and
yeah,
also employees. And so I think
absolutely.
it's just the days of putting out work that's going to be harmful for the environment or not good for the global commons is
Totally.
over.
Totally. But if we look at like who's at the strategy table informing these opportunities, arguably from a discipline perspective, it still may be predominantly biased toward the sort of the business line of thinking. And
Right.
maybe if you look at Silicon Valley, technologists have asserted their voice through computer science, the rise of software. So you could
Hmm.
argue they're another dominant voice at the strategy table.
Right.
Design is young at that table.
Right.
But to your point, like around the greater ecological ramifications of any business or design decision, design better have a seat at that table and be sort of meshed into the problem solving culture of what's happening and what's prioritized and what's driven forward at that strategy table. And so
Right.
that's what I mean when I think about, like, the book is less about talking about design thinking some more or anything. It's more about design's strategic positioning at parity
Right.
with those other disciplines.
Yeah, no, I get that. That's cool, which is a whole new level. And I imagine, companies like Apple, which really led with kind of saying, okay, design isn't just something that's happening in this back room over here. It is the brand,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
And so it's got a table, front seat, equal, right? And so
indeed.
that's probably now the norm. Since I invoked the book, what was some of the key messaging that you have in the book that you'd like to share to the listeners right now?
I think the first thing is, someone might look at the cover and say, like, "Is this just about design?"
Right.
But honestly, I think it's applicable to designers and non-designers, in that I think the future is going to require us to be in more multidisciplinary teams moving forward. Like,
Right.
who's at the table really matters. So if we sort of understand that, we should understand the role that at least design plays in the puzzle. Whether
Hmm.
you're designer or non-designer, like, you should understand the puzzle of what makes something multidisciplinary. And then secondly, this is not just another book that adds to design thinking canon, or
Hmm.
mines the intersection of design and business. It's just really trying to articulate, like, how can we collectively problem solve. And I want to bring my person into the book, and just
Hmm.
tell you, like, here's a series of lived experiences that I've had, and I can showcase how design has absolutely changed my life as an individual. And then through
Interesting.
that, I've also been privileged to be a part of organizations where I watch design change the organization for the better.
That's
And
interesting. Yeah.
right, and the perspectives I share are lightweight enough where individuals as well as organizations can pick them up,
Right.
customize for their own realities, and move them forward.
Imagine, what's going through my mind right now is this book is probably initially oriented toward like larger organizational leaders, but it sounds like anybody who is interested in how to improve just their thinking about collaboration and innovation in their own lives, right? Because we're moving toward like solopreneurship, people
Yeah.
having being on multiple independent teams as ICs, sometimes in and out of employment roles at large organizations. So how is it going to help someone who may be in that kind of vein, more of an independent operator?
Yeah, no, I think with any of those examples you mentioned, we're talking about creatively curious people who are
Right.
aware that the world is changing,
Right.
and even the ground might be shifting underneath their feet, and they're nervous.
Right. Exactly.
So, if anything, I don't claim that the book is some magic pill, but I think through the unpacking of these personal and professional stories, folks will hopefully get inspired and find some, like, guideposts of inspiration to help them string together how they can use the best of their life, live personally and professionally, how they can use the best nutrients to guide their own path forward in a changing
Hmm.
world.
Hmm. That's cool. That's a great vision. And we talked briefly before we started about kind of your vision for the future beyond, design, just as a human being.
Mm.
And I'd love to just talk a little bit about that. Like, why do you think, like your experience, my experience has been like so rich with positive things, right? Great success and lots of challenge along the way, right? But we've cultivated this attitude that you know it's beneficial to be positive and not negative. It's helpful to be a compassionate person, and then you recognize that wow, these are universal principles that everybody should at least stumble upon and try to
Mhm.
adopt. But then you look outside and you read the news and you're like, wow, what a shit show. Like, why is that from your perspective?
Yeah, honestly, I think when it comes to problem solving, I'm a big believer in the butterfly effect.
Yes.
But, like, this book is not going to answer the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Right. No.
It's not going to
Neither is
solve,
this podcast, right?
but unfortunately, I think we do live in a world that has been. It's funny, we say it often. Like, we live in a world that's been informed by design. The enterprises that we work for, the,
Right.
the institutions we navigate, are the way they are by design. So no longer is it enough to just even think about innovation through the lens of like desirability, viability, feasibility,
Mm-hmm.
these kind of things that we talk about innovation, that's no longer enough. We have to think about the broader ecology of what we
Right.
affect. It could be
Right.
environment, it could be our people, it could be ethics, but that's no longer enough because the world has been informed by design. We do have to wrestle with notions of power, privilege,
Mm-hmm.
inequitable access, all these things. And perhaps as much as we think about future and innovation, we also need to like be present in the moment, and we also need to bring historical relevance into the conversation and actually
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
provide visibility to the threads of systemic inequity. I think
Right.
that's part of any problem solving journey. We should appreciate where we've come from and be honest
Right.
about that history.
With that last point, because we did address this kind of early on,
Mhm.
to address systemic inequity, do you believe, like some of the deconstructionists, that we kind of have to deconstruct what's been built that is, that's kind of trapped the inequity, or can we, through more intelligent design, evolve institutions and culture to be more inclusive?
It's
Because they're radically different approaches, right?
totally,
One will lead to kind of more chaos and, you know,
like throwing the baby out the bathwater is probably
right,
not always right.
right.
But unfortunately, with a lot of these conversations, as it relates to what we see in the media, politics, governments, even enterprises and institutions, I could also say that some of the maneuvers haven't been bold enough to really like
Hmm.
offset the precedent of inequity. Like,
Right, which has got a lot of momentum and a lot of rigidity, right? The structures are pretty rigid, and sometimes they're hidden from view from a
yeah,
lot of
and
people.
unfortunately, in the summer of George Floyd, like, and again, these stories were not new to the Black community. And I'm speaking as a Black
Right,
man in
right.
America. Unfortunately, it takes Black bodies, falling
Yep.
victim to police brutality for companies to wake up and start. But still, the behaviors are very performative, very surface level. They're not hiring or
They're
making
PR,
room.
yeah, they're PR tricks.
So
Yeah,
so to your question, I think a strategy, like, don't throw everything away, don't deconstruct everything, but like, can we come up with bold tactics over time that will help get us to a new direction and be bolder than we have been? That's
right.
my hope, at least.
It seems to me that probably one of the best ways for, I mean, this is all human beings, right? Human beings create structures, create organizations. And then we tend to think it's the organization that's the problem. No, it's the human beings still that are in it, and, long after the original people constructed the organization, right? That
Hmm.
system. And to me, like, it seems so simple, like getting, basically learning how to communicate again as peers,
Hmm.
kind of like what you're doing with these entrepreneurs or these people coming from different departments. We need people coming from different walks of life who have joined a common mission,
Yeah.
and in communities, to just come together and start communicating
Hmm.
and sharing, and not in going beyond, like, I love Ken Wilber in Integral Theories as post liberal, post conservative, right? Conversations, or integrated conversations, where
Yeah.
everyone's voice is included and heard, and difficult conversations are addressed. And it takes probably facilitation and expertise, but even that person, whoever those people are, have to be very, very post
Hmm.
rigid, kind of left, right, this, that, you know what I mean? And
Yeah,
so
totally.
we can get there, but the story can't happen by one side pointing fingers at the other, or vice versa. You know what I mean? It has
Yeah,
to
and there's
be like,
there's an
let's
embedded
get together.
assumption.
We're humans first, right?
Yes,
And now
and
let's look at our differences and celebrate them.
I agree. There's a buried assumption around like it's got to be a zero sum game. Well, no.
Right? No,
If we do what you're describing, like, we actually can flourish and create
that's
more
right.
opportunities for everyone. You
It's
know.
like the idea of abundance versus scarcity.
Yeah.
Everyone trying to, claw for the last pie is, no. Let's just open up the borders of the pie and make it huge. You just make it limitless.
Yeah.
Human beings are limitless in my view. You know what I mean? We have great
Indeed.
capacity for care, concern, compassion. We just have to get beyond our own stuckness, our own, biases and shadow. Thank you very much for doing the work that you're doing. Where
Thank
can
you.
people learn more about you and your book? And like, where's a great place for them to kind of come if they're sitting in the car and driving and they want to remember, hey, I want to go check this out, check this guy out.
No, so I'm pretty easy to find. Just at Kevin Bethune on all the major social media platforms, and
Okay.
then my author site is just my name, Kevin Bethune hyphen reimaginingdesign.com, and there's all kinds of doorways in terms of like ways to engage the book or
Yep.
ways to get over to the business side of what defines my experience over
Excellent.
at Dreams Design and Life. That's another website people can go to just understand a little bit more about what
Dreams, design, and life, all one kind of like,
you
okay,
got it.
we got it. Well, we'll put this stuff in the show notes and on the website as well. Kevin, thanks so much for joining me today. It's really very fascinating conversation, and I appreciate you for doing your work and also for standing up for what's right, in the world in terms of where we need to go as leaders.
Well, thank you, Mark. Honored by your story and all the incredible things that you've done. And it's been an honor to be in conversation with you,
Yeah,
honestly.
ditto. And I'll see you on Nike campus when we go visit and go get some freebies.
Yeah. Sounds good.
All right, brother.
All right.
Thank you so much. All right, take care.